Let's discuss this further now with IRS Forensic Investigations Chad Thomas. Chad, good to have you. Thank you very much for coming on. How sophisticated are these networks of coal smugglers in the country?
Very good evening to you and the listeners. And before I comment, I just want to say thank you to Newzroom Afrika. From very early this morning, and in fact the whole day, they've been focusing on organized crime in South Africa and the different syndicates that are operating. And this is something that we really need in South Africa. It's something that we're calling on the President to do in terms of having fireside chats, talking to the public, taking the public into his confidence. And I think this was a very important start with what Newzroom Afrika did today. To talk about the syndicate, this was a very sophisticated syndicate. If one looks at the syndicate, it's operated for quite some time. As you rightly pointed out, Sars have reported that they were swapping out high-grade coal for low-grade coal. And this obviously has had a direct impact, not just on the fiscus, but on the power utilities operations. It's also damaged our critical infrastructure. But I think we cannot underplay or take for granted what Sars has told us. What Sars has told us is that there are now these interagency, intergovernmental task teams that have been created. And this particular task team is known as the NatJoins Energy Safety and Security Priority Committee, which is tasked with investigating the attacks on our critical infrastructure, economic sabotage, economic terrorism, for want of a better term. And this is a paradigm shift in the way in which crime fighting has been undertaken in South Africa. What makes this so very important is we're seeing that they're looking at alternatives to the traditional way of fighting crime. And if one goes back to the 1930s, the 1940s in America, when it was beset with criminal activities from an organized crime perspective, the way they took down Al Capone and his sophisticated organized crime syndicate was to look at tax evasion. And this is what Sars is now doing together with other agencies. They're looking at what they can do from a low-hanging fruit perspective, looking at how these structures have been created, how people have evaded tax, and how they can now target them, most probably through lifestyle audits and other types of investigation techniques.
So you're saying a major factor here would generally be the fact that there was some kind of a joint effort, but also a specific focus on the tax evasion aspect of it, more than actually trying to stop the trucks on the road and checking if the coal is of the quality that it's supposed to be.
They're hitting them where it hurts the most. They're hitting them in their pockets. They're doing financial threat analysis. They're doing lifestyle audits, and they're looking deep into these syndicates and how they're operating. We all see these guys living in these luxury homes. We see them driving luxury cars, and we all wonder, you know, when is the taxman going to catch up to them? Or not just is the taxman catching up to them, but the taxman is using that as a means to an end to further criminal investigations together with their counterparts in law enforcement from the DPCI, from the FIC, to nail these guys in terms of financial crime and specifically in terms of money laundering, proceeds of crime, and everything that's contained within the Prevention of Organized Crime Act.
Yeah, we always talk about how this undermines foreign direct investment, but by the looks of things, the webs of this coal smuggler network consists not only of locals but also foreign nationals. So there is a sense that some international players are also coming to the picture. And how does that complicate, I suppose, SARS's ability to be able to track those kind of transactions? Let me put it that way.
South Africa has a very good relationship with the Egmont Group together with FATSA, the Financial Action Task Force. In fact, the ex-head of the Financial Intelligence Center also sat as chair of this international organization. We have been grey listed. It's of grave importance that we get off that grey list because it has had an economic effect on our country and will continue to have an economic effect on our country the longer we stay on that grey list. As a result of the grey listing, the world is looking to us to see what we're going to do to prevent organized crime from flourishing, to prevent money laundering on an international scale. And they're obviously making their resources available to us as well. So when one looks at this coal syndicate, obviously high-grade coal needs a market. It's an international market. One just has to look at what's happening in Richards Bay to see the amount of coal that's exported from South Africa. And there's a lot of private sector players that are involved in the exports of coal. And it's these private sector players that have corrupted members of Eskom and other organizations to provide them with this coal. One must remember that when one looks at fraud and corruption, there's a symbiotic relationship between corrupt actors both in the private sector and the public sector, and their obvious intention is to try in any way to plunder the public purse, whether it's through the creation of tenders, whether it's through contracts, whether it's through the theft of high-grade coal. But this kind of operation by Sars, being an interagency operation that was most probably led by Sars, but with all the other agencies supporting them in terms of the raids, etc., is a good sign of things to come. We just hope that they use this as momentum to carry forward and to look at all kinds of crime syndicates that are operating in South Africa.
You can call it an investigative breakthrough, but as you put it, these syndicates are many, and maybe this could be one web of it that has been roped in, but I'm sure the others are looking, and how quickly do they learn how to circumvent the system. And one could also even assume at this particular point that the fact that this particular net joint is so effective is that it has not yet been infiltrated by politicians, and there's no political influence over it at this point.
I think we've reached the point now where we know that there's political interference in investigations, and the state has had to take a long, hard look at itself together with these different agencies. When one looks at the different roles played by different law enforcement agencies, the different units that are created in the legislation that we have the right units, we have the right legislation, we just haven't had that political willpower. We've seen how budget hasn't been allocated correctly, and we've seen that this has created a situation where the lead agencies don't have the resources and the capacity. Specifically, when one looks at the DPCI, for example, the DPCI has a unit known as the PCMC, which is responsible for financial threat analysis. They don't have sufficient members. They don't have sufficient budget. But when you start seeing FEEC and you start seeing SARS and you start seeing the Reserve Bank, all of these organizations coming together, it starts working. And that's why I've called on several occasions for this establishment of this mega war room that can put all these units together and they can drive all of these different cases on a collective basis, because we need the input, the expertise from these different law enforcement agencies as well as different government organizations to be able to break the back of crime.
So we've got clearly from this an indication that we now have somewhat beefed up our business units at SARS or even our systems at SARS to the point where we are able to detect all these areas, these 5 areas that have been picked up here: non-registration of income tax, VAT and PAYE, failure to submit tax returns, under declaration of income, claiming undue VAT refunds and making false submissions, all these amounting to fraud. Is there more that needs to be put into that basket that would help us unlock even further?
Yes, and when one looks at what's available in terms of the Prevention of Organised Crime Act and how that act is being used effectively by South Africa, we can use so much in that in respect of looking at the proceeds of crime, looking at who the enablers are, and looking at prosecuting those that are responsible. One must remember that our Prevention of Organised Crime Act that criminalizes the proceeds of crime and money laundering, etc., was promulgated in 1998, and it led to the establishment in 1999 of the Asset Forfeiture Unit. And very quickly we saw cases being enrolled, and we saw interim restraints and preservation orders being taken out over accounts that were being held by criminal syndicates and their enablers. When one looks at America and their RICO Act, which a lot of our POCA Act is based on, that act was introduced in 1970, but only started to be used with great success in the early 80s in the United States. We started using our act in 1999, and then things slowed down. It seems like we're picking up momentum once again. We have the legislation, we have the units, we just need budget and infrastructure and resources made available to these critical units so that they can do their jobs.
Chad, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on and once again highlighting some of the important issues here that we need to deal with in cutting the throat of these syndicates that are sabotaging the economy of the country.